Maria Santos had worked in government buildings for 15 years, but she had never felt smaller than she did standing in the marble hallway outside the West Wing conference room. The heavy wooden doors had just closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through her chest. "Outside, now," Senator Williams had said, barely looking up from his briefing papers. The other officials around the mahogany table had continued their conversation as if she had never existed. After 3 hours of preparation, after staying up until 2 in the morning reviewing economic data from 12 different countries, after missing her daughter's school play to be ready for this meeting, Maria found herself dismissed like an unwanted interruption. She pressed her back against the cold wall and tried to steady her breathing. Her hands were still trembling slightly from the humiliation. 23 years old, fresh out of graduate school, and apparently invisible to the people who made decisions that affected millions of lives. The leather portfolio in her hands contained research that could change the direction of international trade policy, but nobody wanted to hear it from someone who looked like she should be serving coffee instead of analyzing global markets. The hallway stretched in both directions, lined with portraits of men who had shaped American history. Their painted eyes seemed to watch her with the same dismissive expression she had just experienced in the conference room. Maria had grown up seeing those faces in textbooks, dreaming of the day she might contribute to the conversations that happened in these halls. Instead, she had been treated like furniture that someone had accidentally left in the wrong room. Her phone buzzed with a text from her roommate asking how the big meeting went. Maria stared at the screen, unable to find words that would not sound pathetic. How could she explain that after years of academic excellence, after graduating summa cum laude with degrees in international economics and political science, after landing what she thought was her dream job as a junior policy analyst, she had been dismissed from the most important meeting of her career without being allowed to speak a single word? The sound of laughter drifted through the conference room doors. Male voices discussing trade agreements and diplomatic strategies, the same topics Maria had spent months studying. She knew more about Southeast Asian market dynamics than anyone else in that room, but her knowledge meant nothing when delivered by someone who did not fit their image of expertise. Maria walked slowly toward the exit, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Each step felt like a small defeat. The security guards nodded politely as she passed, but their expressions held the same dismissive quality she had encountered everywhere since starting this job. Too young, too female, too different from the people who traditionally held power in these spaces. Outside, Washington, D.C. buzzed with its usual energy. Tourists took pictures of the White House fence while protesters held signs about various causes. Business people in expensive suits hurried past, talking loudly into phones about deals and deadlines. The world continued moving while Maria felt completely still, frozen by the realization that her dreams might be much harder to achieve than she had imagined. She found a bench in Lafayette Square and sat down heavily. Pigeons gathered near her feet, hoping for crumbs she did not have. Maria opened her portfolio and looked at the research that had been rejected without consideration. Months of work, hundreds of pages of analysis, recommendations that could improve trade relationships and create jobs for American workers. All of it dismissed because the messenger did not match the message they expected to hear. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed her mother's number, but Maria could not bring herself to answer. How could she tell the woman who had cleaned offices at night to pay for Maria's education that her daughter had just been humiliated in the halls of power? Her mother had sacrificed everything to give Maria opportunities she had never had, and this was the result. A jogger ran past, then doubled back and stopped near the bench. Maria looked up to see a woman in her 40s wearing a simple tracksuit and baseball cap. There was something familiar about her face, but Maria could not place where she had seen her before. "Excuse me," the woman said, slightly out of breath. "I think you dropped this near the White House entrance." She held out a small notebook that had fallen from Maria's portfolio. Maria took the notebook gratefully. It contained her personal observations about the meeting, thoughts she had planned to review later. "Thank you so much. I would have been lost without this." The woman studied Maria's face for a moment. "You look like you've had a difficult day. Government work? Is it that obvious?" Maria managed a weak smile. "I just came from a meeting where I learned that having good ideas means nothing if you're not the right kind of person to present them. I've been in similar situations, the woman said, sitting down on the bench beside Maria. More times than I care to remember. What kind of work do you do? Maria found herself opening up to the stranger in a way she had not expected. She explained her background, her research, and the humiliating experience in the conference room. The woman listened without interruption, occasionally nodding with understanding that seemed to come from personal experience. You know, the woman said when Maria finished her story, rejection in these buildings often says more about the people doing the rejecting than about the person being rejected. The challenge is finding the right audience for your ideas. I'm not sure that audience exists, Maria replied. At least not for someone like me. Someone like you? Young, female, not connected to the right families or schools. I got this job based on my grades and test scores, but that's not enough here. People want someone who looks like their idea of an expert. The woman was quiet for a moment, watching the tourists and protesters across the street. Can I ask you something? If you could present your research to anyone in government, who would it be? Maria laughed bitterly. The president, I suppose. But that's about as likely as winning the lottery twice in the same day. You might be surprised, the woman said, standing up from the bench. Sometimes the most important conversations happen when we least expect them. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card. My name is Rebecca Chen. I work in the executive office of the president. If you're serious about getting your ideas heard, send me your research. I promise someone will read it carefully. Maria took the card, studying the official seal and contact information. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Rebecca smiled. Because 15 years ago, I was sitting on this same bench after being dismissed from a meeting where I knew more than everyone else in the room combined. Someone gave me a chance when I needed it most. Consider this paying it forward. She jogged away before Maria could respond, leaving her alone with a business card that might change everything. Maria looked at the card again, then at her portfolio full of rejected research. For the first time since leaving the conference room, she felt something other than defeat. Maybe her knowledge would find its audience after all. The sun was setting over the Capitol, painting the White House in golden light. Maria gathered her things and walked toward the metro station, her mind already working on how to present her research in a way that could not be dismissed. She had been told to go outside, but perhaps that was exactly where she needed to be to find her way back in. 3 days later, Maria's carefully formatted research package sat on Rebecca Chen's desk in the Eisenhower Executive Office building. What she did not know was that Rebecca had already scheduled a briefing with senior staff, and that her analysis of Southeast Asian markets had arrived at exactly the moment the administration needed fresh perspectives on a crisis that was developing faster than anyone anticipated. The dismissal that had felt like an ending was about to become a beginning, though Maria would not learn this until her phone rang with an invitation that would change her life forever. Sometimes the most important doors open only after others have been slammed shut, and sometimes being told to go outside is the first step toward being invited back in as the expert everyone suddenly needs to hear. The phone call came at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Maria had sent her research to Rebecca Chen. She had been making coffee in her tiny apartment kitchen when her phone rang with an unknown number that showed a Washington, D.C. area code. Maria almost ignored it, assuming it was another robocall about extended car warranties or student loan forgiveness scams. Maria Santos? The voice was crisp, professional, and unfamiliar. Yes, this is Maria. She turned off the coffee maker and gave the call her full attention. This is David Morrison from the White House Personnel Office. We need you to come in for a briefing this morning. How quickly can you get to the West Wing? Maria's coffee mug slipped from her hand, shattering against the kitchen tile. Hot coffee spread across the floor, but she barely noticed. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Did you say the West Wing? Yes, ma'am. There's a situation developing that requires your specific expertise in Southeast Asian markets. Can you be here in an hour? This is time sensitive. Maria stared at the broken mug at her feet, trying to process what was happening. 3 weeks of silence after submitting her research, 3 weeks of wondering if Rebecca Chen had actually read her analysis or if the business card had been nothing more than a polite brush-off. Now someone from the White House was asking for her expertise on exactly the topics she had been studying.
Yes, absolutely. I can be there in an hour.
She was already moving toward her bedroom to find appropriate clothes.
Should I bring anything specific?
Bring whatever research materials you have on Vietnamese manufacturing, Indonesian trade policies, and Thai currency fluctuations. We're particularly interested in your analysis of how regional economic changes might affect American agricultural exports.
Maria's heart raced.
Those were exactly the topics she had covered in her rejected research. Someone had not only read her work but understood its implications well enough to know which specific areas were most relevant. She pulled her navy blue suit from the closet, the same one she had worn to the conference room where she had been dismissed. "I'll be there," she said, surprising herself with how confident she sounded.
Should I report to the same entrance I used before?
No, you'll be coming through the West Wing staff entrance.
Security will have your name. Ask for David Morrison when you arrive.
The line went dead, leaving Maria staring at her phone in disbelief. She looked around her apartment, taking in the broken coffee mug, the clothes scattered across her bed, and the stack of job applications she had been preparing to send out after her previous humiliation. Everything felt surreal, as if she had stepped into someone else's life. She cleaned up the coffee quickly and got dressed, her mind racing through everything she knew about the current economic situation in Southeast Asia. The region had been experiencing significant changes in the past month, with new trade agreements being negotiated and currency values fluctuating in ways that could impact American businesses. Her research had predicted some of these changes, but she had not expected anyone in government to be paying attention to her analysis. The metro ride to downtown Washington felt like the longest and shortest journey of her life. Maria reviewed her notes on her phone, preparing for questions she might be asked. She had no idea what specific situation had prompted this urgent call, but she was determined to be ready for anything. The West Wing staff entrance was smaller and less imposing than the main visitor entrance she had used before. The security guard checked her identification against a list and directed her to a waiting area where several other people sat with briefcases and serious expressions. Maria recognized some of them as senior analysts she had seen in government directories.
Maria Santos?
A tall man in his 50s approached her.
I'm David Morrison. Thank you for coming in on short notice.
He led her through hallways she had never seen before, past offices where staff members worked at computers and talked quietly into phones. The atmosphere was different from her previous visit to the government building. There was an energy here, a sense of urgency that suggested important decisions were being made.
Can you tell me what this is about? Maria asked as they walked. Vietnamese manufacturing companies have started canceling contracts with American agricultural exporters, David explained.
The cancellations began 2 weeks ago, and we're trying to understand if this represents a larger trend or a temporary disruption.
Your research on Vietnamese economic policy caught our attention because you predicted something very similar to what we're seeing now.
Maria felt a surge of excitement mixed with nervousness. Her analysis had suggested that Vietnam's new trade relationships with other Asian countries might lead to reduced dependence on American agricultural imports, but she had not expected her predictions to be proven correct so quickly or dramatically. They stopped outside a conference room that looked much like the one where Maria had been dismissed, but the atmosphere was completely different. David knocked and opened the door to reveal a table surrounded by people who looked up expectantly as Maria entered.
Everyone, this is Maria Santos, the analyst who wrote the research on Southeast Asian market dynamics.
David gestured for Maria to take a seat at the table. Maria, these are senior staff members from State, Commerce, and Agriculture departments. They've all read your work. Maria sat down, acutely aware that every person at the table was at least 20 years older than her and held positions she had only dreamed of reaching. But, instead of the dismissive expression she had encountered before, she saw faces that looked genuinely interested in what she had to say. "Ms. Santos," said a woman with silver hair who introduced herself as Deputy Secretary Williams from the State Department.
Your research suggested that Vietnam would begin diversifying its agricultural imports by the third quarter of this year. Can you walk us through your reasoning?
For the next 2 hours, Maria found herself in the kind of discussion she had always hoped to have. The officials around the table asked detailed questions about her methodology, challenged her assumptions in ways that showed they understood the complexity of international economics, and listened carefully to her responses. They wanted to know not just what was happening, but why it was happening and what might happen next. The Vietnamese decision is part of a larger strategy, Maria explained, referring to charts she had prepared weeks earlier.
They're reducing economic dependence on any single country, including the United States. It's not personal or political, it's practical. They're diversifying risk. What would you recommend as our response? Asked the Commerce Department representative. Maria took a deep breath.
This was the moment she had been preparing for her entire career, the chance to influence policy decisions that would affect thousands of American farmers and businesses.
We need to accept that the old relationship dynamics are changing, she said. Instead of trying to maintain exclusive trade relationships, we should focus on becoming the preferred partner in a more competitive environment. That means offering better terms, more flexible agreements, and showing that we understand their long-term economic goals. The room was quiet for a moment as the officials considered her words. Maria wondered if she had said too much, if her recommendations were too bold for someone at her level. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need, Deputy Secretary Williams said finally. Traditional approaches aren't working in these new market conditions. We need fresh perspectives. As the meeting continued, Maria realized that her previous dismissal had led directly to this opportunity. Rebecca Chen had not only read her research but had shared it with exactly the right people at exactly the right time. The rejection that had felt like a career-ending humiliation had actually been preparation for this moment. When the meeting ended, David Morrison walked with Maria back toward the exit. "We'd like you to prepare a comprehensive brief on potential policy responses," he said. "How long would you need to put together a detailed analysis?" "I actually have most of it already prepared," Maria replied. "I can have a complete brief ready by tomorrow afternoon." David smiled. "I thought you might. Rebecca Chen told us you were thorough. She also mentioned that you might be interested in a more permanent role working on these issues." Maria stopped walking. "A permanent role?" "We'll discuss the details after we see your brief, but yes. The administration is looking for analysts who can anticipate market changes instead of just reacting to them. Your work suggests you have that capability." As Maria left the White House complex, she felt like she was walking in a completely different world than the one she had entered that morning. Her phone was already buzzing with texts from her mother and roommate, but she would wait to call them back until she could find words adequate to describe what had just happened. 3 weeks ago, she had been told to go outside. Today, she had been invited into the most important conversations in American foreign policy. The research that had been dismissed without a hearing had become the foundation for urgent policy discussions. Her expertise, once invisible, was now essential. The real test would come tomorrow when she submitted her policy brief. But, for the first time since starting her career in government, Maria felt confident that her ideas would be judged on their merit rather than dismissed because of who was presenting them. Sometimes the most important opportunities come disguised as rejections, and sometimes being underestimated is the best preparation for proving everyone wrong. Maria submitted her policy brief at exactly 2 p.m. the next day, 37 pages of detailed analysis that represented everything she had learned about international economics and policy implementation. She had worked through the night, surviving on coffee and determination, crafting recommendations that could reshape America's approach to Southeast Asian trade relationships. The response came faster than she had expected. By 4:30 that afternoon, David Morrison called to schedule another meeting, this time with an even more senior group of officials. The brief had been circulated to the National Security Council, and they wanted to discuss immediate implementation of her recommendations. "There's something else," David said during the phone call. "The president has asked to be briefed on this situation tomorrow morning. Your analysis will be the foundation of that briefing." Maria had to sit down. The president.
Her research, which had been dismissed from a minor policy meeting just a month ago, would now inform a presidential briefing on international trade policy. The irony was not lost on her, but she was too focused on the implications to dwell on past humiliations. The next morning's meeting took place in the Roosevelt Room, a formal conference space that Maria had only seen in photographs. Oil paintings of Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt watched over a polished table where some of the most important decisions in American government were made. Maria arrived 30 minutes early, carrying updated research materials and wearing the same navy suit that was quickly becoming her uniform. She was reviewing her notes when officials began filing into the room. Deputy Secretary Williams from State, Under Secretary Chen from Commerce, National Security Advisor Roberts, and several other senior officials whose names Maria recognized from news reports. The atmosphere was serious, focused, and very different from the exploratory discussion they had held the day before.
Ms. Santos, National Security Advisor Roberts said as he took his seat at the head of the table.
Your brief has been reviewed by multiple departments and the President's senior staff. Before we proceed with implementation, we need to understand the potential consequences of your recommendations. For the next hour, Maria found herself defending and explaining her analysis to some of the most powerful people in American government. They asked about economic modeling, diplomatic implications, and potential responses from other countries. Every question required precise answers backed by data and reasoning that could withstand intense scrutiny.
Your recommendation to offer Vietnam preferential trade status in agricultural products, Under Secretary Chen said, consulting his notes. That could trigger similar demands from other countries in the region. How do we avoid setting precedents that undermine our negotiating position elsewhere? Maria had anticipated this question.
The key is to tie preferential status to specific conditions that other countries may not be able or willing to meet.
Vietnam's strategic position and established infrastructure make them unique.
We're not creating a template, we're acknowledging exceptional circumstances.
What about domestic opposition?
Deputy Secretary Williams asked. American agricultural lobby groups have been pushing for exclusive trade relationships.
Your approach essentially admits that exclusivity is no longer viable.
With respect, Maria replied, exclusivity hasn't been viable for several years. We've been pretending otherwise while losing market share to competitors who adapted faster to changing conditions. My recommendations acknowledge reality and position us to compete effectively rather than pretending we can maintain monopolistic relationships.
The questions continued, each one more complex than the last.
Maria realized that this was not just a policy discussion but an examination of her capability to think strategically under pressure. These officials needed to know whether she could handle the responsibility of influencing presidential decisions on international economic policy.
There's one more issue we need to address, National Security Advisor Roberts said toward the end of the meeting. Implementation of your recommendations would require ongoing analysis and adjustment.
The situation in Southeast Asia is evolving rapidly, and we need someone who can monitor developments and advise on necessary policy modifications. Maria sensed where this conversation was heading, but she waited for him to continue. We're prepared to offer you a position as Senior Analyst for Southeast Asian Economic Policy, reporting directly to the National Security Council. The position would involve regular briefings to senior staff and, when necessary, to the President himself.
The room was silent as Maria processed the offer. Senior Analyst. Direct reporting to the National Security Council. Presidential briefings.
3 months ago, she had been a junior analyst whose voice had never been heard in important meetings.
Now she was being offered a position that would make her one of the youngest senior analysts in the administration.
I'm honored by the offer, Maria said carefully.
Can you tell me more about the specific responsibilities?
You would be our primary expert on economic developments in Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia, Roberts explained. You'd work with state and commerce to develop policy responses to economic changes in those countries.
You'd also coordinate with our diplomatic posts to ensure our economic intelligence is current and accurate.
There's one more thing, Deputy Secretary Williams added.
The President has requested a personal briefing on your research tomorrow morning.
He wants to understand your analysis before making final decisions on policy changes. This would be your first presidential briefing, but it certainly wouldn't be your last if you accept this position. Maria felt her heart racing, but her voice remained steady.
I accept the position.
And I'll be ready for the briefing tomorrow morning. The meeting ended with handshakes and congratulations, but Maria barely registered the social pleasantries. Her mind was already working on how to present complex economic analysis to the president in a way that would be both comprehensive and accessible. She had watched presidential briefings on television, but preparing to deliver one herself was an entirely different challenge. That evening, Maria worked with a team of senior analysts to prepare materials for the presidential briefing. They reviewed her research, helped her anticipate questions the president might ask, and advised her on the communication style that would be most effective in the Oval Office. "Remember," said Rebecca Chen, who had appeared as part of the briefing preparation team, "you're not there to impress anyone. You're there to provide information the president needs to make good decisions. Focus on clarity and practical implications."
Maria looked at Rebecca with new understanding. "You knew this would happen, didn't you? When you gave me your business card that day in the park."
Rebecca smiled. "I knew your research was exceptional, and I knew the administration needed exactly the kind of analysis you could provide. But you earned this opportunity through the quality of your work, not through any favoritism." As Maria walked home that evening, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The dismissal that had seemed like the end of her career had actually been the beginning of something much larger. Her research had been rejected by officials who were not prepared to hear new ideas, but it had found its audience among people who were ready for innovative approaches to complex problems. The next morning would bring her first presidential briefing, a responsibility that most analysts never experience in their entire careers. Maria had gone from being told to leave the room to being asked to advise the most powerful person in the world. The expertise that had been dismissed as irrelevant was now considered essential to national policy decisions. Her phone rang as she reached her apartment building. The caller ID showed her mother's number, and this time Maria answered without hesitation. "Mija, how was your day at work?" her mother asked in the same tone she had used when Maria was in elementary school. "It was interesting, Mom," Maria replied, smiling at the understatement. "I think I'm finally in the right job for my skills."
"That's wonderful, Mija. I always knew you would find where you belong."
As Maria hung up the phone, she realized her mother was right. She had found where she belonged, though the path had been nothing like what she had expected. Tomorrow she would brief the president on Southeast Asian economic policy, but tonight she would celebrate the fact that sometimes the most important doors open only after we've been forced to find new ways to approach them. The dismissal that had humiliated her had led directly to the opportunity that would define her career. Being told to go outside had prepared her for the invitation to come back in as an essential voice in national policy decisions. Sometimes rejection is not an ending but a redirection towards something much better than what we originally thought we wanted. Maria arrived at the West Wing at 7 a.m., 2 hours before her scheduled briefing with the president. She wanted time to review her materials one final time and calm her nerves before the most important meeting of her career. The same security guards who had barely acknowledged her presence during her first visits now greeted her by name and directed her to a small office where she could prepare. The office had been assigned to her as the new senior analyst for Southeast Asian economic policy, though she had not had time to personalize it yet. Her research materials were organized on the desk in neat stacks, and a large monitor displayed real-time economic data from Asian markets. Everything she needed to brief the president was within reach, but Maria found herself staring out the window at the White House grounds, trying to process how dramatically her life had changed in just 1 month.
At 8:30, Rebecca Chen knocked on her door.
"Ready for this?" she asked, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing an encouraging smile. "I think so," Maria replied, gathering her briefing materials.
"I've been preparing for this my entire career, even when I didn't know it."
They walked through the West Wing corridors toward the Oval Office, passing staff members who nodded respectfully to Maria. Word had spread quickly about the young analyst who had predicted the Vietnamese trade situation and proposed solutions that senior officials were taking seriously. Maria was no longer an invisible junior employee but a recognized expert whose opinions mattered.
Remember, Rebecca said as they approached the Oval Office, the president prefers direct communication. He'll ask specific questions and wants specific answers. Don't worry about being too technical.
He understands complex issues, and he's read your brief. The door to the Oval Office was opened by a Secret Service agent who stepped aside to let them enter. Maria had seen this room in countless photographs and television broadcasts, but being inside it felt surreal. The curved walls, the presidential seal woven into the carpet, the famous resolute desk where so many historic decisions had been made. Everything was exactly as she had imagined, yet completely different from seeing it on screen. President Harrison stood near the windows overlooking the South Lawn, reading what Maria recognized as her policy brief. He was younger than she had expected, with an energy that filled the room even when he was standing still. When he looked up and saw Maria, he crossed the room with an outstretched hand and a genuine smile.
Ms. Santos, thank you for coming in. I've read your analysis twice, and I have some questions.
He gestured toward a seating area with couches and chairs arranged around a coffee table.
Please, have a seat.
Maria sat down, placing her materials on the table while the president settled into a chair across from her. National Security Advisor Roberts and Deputy Secretary Williams joined them, but the president's attention was focused entirely on Maria.
Your research predicted the Vietnamese trade cancellations 3 months before they happened, the president began. Walk me through your thinking.
What did you see that others missed? For the next 30 minutes, Maria found herself in the most intense and rewarding conversation of her professional life.
The president asked detailed questions about economic modeling, diplomatic implications, and practical implementation strategies.
He challenged her assumptions not to undermine her analysis but to ensure he understood every aspect of her recommendations. The traditional approach, Maria explained, referring to charts she had prepared, assumes that economic relationships are static and that we can maintain preferential status through political pressure.
But economic partnerships are increasingly based on mutual benefit rather than historical precedent.
Vietnam is making rational decisions about trade relationships, and we need to respond rationally rather than emotionally.
What's our timeline for implementation? The president asked. How quickly can we adjust our approach?
The sooner we move, the better our position will be, Maria replied.
Every week we delay gives other countries more opportunity to establish stronger relationships with Vietnamese partners.
But we also need to be careful not to appear desperate. Confidence is as important as speed in these negotiations. The president leaned back in his chair, studying Maria with an expression she could not read.
Ms. Santos, how old are you?
23, Mr. President.
23, he repeated, shaking his head slightly.
When I was 23, I was selling insurance and trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. You're sitting in the Oval Office briefing me on international economic policy that could affect millions of jobs and billions of dollars in trade. Maria was not sure how to respond, so she waited for him to continue. I'm told that just a month ago, you were dismissed from a policy meeting for being too junior to contribute to the discussion.
Is that accurate?
Yes, sir, that's accurate. Maria felt heat rising in her cheeks but maintained eye contact with the president.
And now you're my primary advisor on Southeast Asian economic policy. What changed? Maria thought carefully before answering.
Nothing changed about my qualifications or my analysis, Mr. President. What changed was finding the right audience for my expertise.
Sometimes good ideas need to find the right room before they can be heard. The president smiled. That's exactly right.
And sometimes we need to create new rooms for voices that haven't been heard in the old ones. He turned to National Security Advisor Roberts. I want Ms. Santos to lead our policy development on this issue. Give her whatever resources she needs. Yes, Mr. President, Roberts replied. We've already discussed expanding her role and providing additional staff support.
Good. The president stood, signaling that the briefing was ending. Ms. Santos, I want weekly updates on developments in Southeast Asia.
If your analysis continues to be as accurate as it has been, you'll be briefing me regularly on a range of international economic issues. Maria gathered her materials, still processing what had just happened.
Weekly presidential briefings. Leading policy development.
Additional staff support. 6 weeks ago, she had been a junior analyst whose voice was never heard.
Now she was being asked to lead policy initiatives that would affect America's position in global markets.
Mr. President, she said as they shook hands again, thank you for this opportunity.
I won't disappoint you. Ms. Santos, he replied, you've already exceeded everyone's expectations. I'm looking forward to seeing what you accomplish next.
As Maria left the Oval Office, she felt like she was walking through a dream. The hallways that had once seemed intimidating now felt familiar. Staff members who had ignored her presence now stopped to congratulate her on her new role. The building that had rejected her was now her professional home.
Rebecca Chen was waiting outside the Oval Office with a huge smile.
So, how did it go? I think it went well, Maria replied, though she was still processing everything that had happened. He asked me to lead policy development and provide weekly briefings.
That's incredible.
From being told to leave the room to leading presidential briefings in 6 weeks.
I don't think that's ever happened before.
As they walked back toward Maria's office, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The dismissal that had humiliated her had forced her to find new approaches and different audiences for her expertise. Being underestimated had motivated her to prove her capabilities in ways that exceeded everyone's expectations.
Her phone buzzed with a text message from her mother. How did your big meeting go, Mija?
This time, Maria had an answer that would make her mother proud. She had found her place in the halls of power, not by fitting into existing expectations but by demonstrating that new perspectives could provide better solutions to complex problems. Her expertise was no longer invisible but essential to presidential decision-making. The expertise that had been dismissed as irrelevant was now shaping national policy. The voice that had been silenced was now being heard in the most important room in American government. Maria had gone from being told to go outside to being invited to stay and lead, proving that sometimes the most valuable insights come from unexpected sources. That evening, Maria called her mother to share the news about her presidential briefing and expanded role. As she described her new responsibilities, she realized that her mother's sacrifices had made this moment possible. The woman who had cleaned offices at night so her daughter could attend college was now the mother of a senior government analyst who briefed the president on international policy. I'm so proud of you, Mija, her mother said, her voice thick with emotion. You never gave up, even when they tried to make you feel small.
I learned from you, Mom, Maria replied.
You taught me that persistence and hard work eventually find their reward, even when the path isn't what we expected. As Maria hung up the phone, she looked around her new office and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new briefings, and new opportunities to influence policy decisions that mattered. But, tonight, she would celebrate the fact that sometimes the most important victories come after the most painful defeats. The dismissal that had seemed like an ending had actually been the beginning of everything she had ever wanted to achieve. Being told to go outside had prepared her for the invitation to come back in as an essential voice in American foreign policy. Sometimes rejection is not a judgment but a redirection toward opportunities that are better than anything we originally imagined possible.